Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Iman, and today we are joined by Dr. Asim Qureshi, who is the research director of the advocacy group CAGE, which aims to empower communities impacted by the war on terror. He has a background in law and has authored a number of books, including most recently, I Refuse to Condemn, Resisting Racism in Times of National Security, which was published by Manchester University Press. Please do have a look of it. And today he'll be touching upon the themes he explores in one of his other books, A Virtue of Disobedience, which explores what activism looks like in this Islamic tradition. Dr. Asim, if you can start.
جزاكم الله خير إيمان. بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاكم الله خير for the invitation to this Manchester University ISoc event. Alhamdulillah, it's always an honor to be able to share some thoughts with Muslims in different parts of the world. And especially as having been a former student myself, once upon a many years ago, it was always, I know, quite difficult sometimes to be able to get speakers to speak about certain topics. So inshallah, I hope that this proves beneficial for me and for you as well, and that together we might be able to think through some of the themes that I'll be trying to discuss with you today. Sorry, it's a bit strange speaking out into the void when you can't see anyone else, so do forgive me if I look a bit strange as I'm speaking. I'm not used to speaking to, I guess, effectively myself. So ultimately, A Virtue of Disobedience, which was my previous book, was published last year. It is an attempt to think about what our activism looks like through the lens of faith. So many of us are used to studying various social justice movements from a number of different perspectives, but I always had a question in my own mind, having been an activist for most of my adult life, about what it meant in terms of ta'abbud, in terms of worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it was never just about the efficacy of doing something. It was more about, okay, how does this fit within the circulatory system of my Islam? So is it something that's separate? Is it something that's connected? And as I write in the introduction of A Virtue of Disobedience, I didn't want to be in a situation where I was literally clocking out of my activism to clock into the masjid for the salah. Like, there had to be something that connected the two things together. And that's really why I wrote this book. It was, ultimately, first for me, it started off just as a journal of me kind of reflecting on why certain scholars would make such a strong emphasis on separating or secularizing the world from ibadah. What was it about this? And it was one khutbah in particular that my sons attended, where the imam said that standing up in protest to the police when they brutalize you is an act of kufr, because it's going against the state. And I felt very, very strongly, I had a very visceral reaction to this imam saying this, and especially because my kids were in the room. This was in 2017, like at the height of kind of Black lives being murdered and executed on the streets of America, and it was the first time I had a conversation with my children that, look, just because we put our imams in a position of extreme importance, like they're literally like your fathers, okay, that's how you should, what kind of respect you should treat them with. They don't always get things right. And that was a very hard conversation for me to have with my children, because we've never taught them disobedience. We never taught them to disobey any adult that they ever come across. It's always obedience. And so that's really where the title of the book came from. It was trying to think through what a virtuous disobedience might look like, one that is rooted in our faith, we're taught so often to be obedient. Is there a notion of disobedience that is virtuous? And so that's effectively what the book explores, just as a summary of where it came from, and how my thinking was trying to develop as I wrote the book. And as I said, the book kind of really wrote itself, because it was all just kind of thoughts that were flowing as I was going along. So I do have a whole presentation on the book, but what I've done is to cut out huge sections in order to focus on some of the main themes, because we've got a lack of time. I've got, I think, another half an hour left before I need to stop. So I'm going to try and summarize some of the key areas that I try and present within the book, and then hopefully, inshallah, in the Q&A we can have some more detailed discussion. But really, the starting sections of the book is really me trying to emphasize the notion that history is a site of instruction for us, that the Quran itself, 1/3 of it is filled with the stories of the people of the past. We know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do people think that they will be left to say we believe without being put to the test? So the entire presentation of stories of these anbiya, of the people of the past, it's instructive. Quran is a book of guidance, and therefore every single story that is told is something that we're supposed to take something from. But what I say is that I don't think we should just limit ourselves to the stories of the Quran as being sites of instruction for us. I think the whole of history opens itself up to us to really think about in different ways. And so that's really the initial argument of the book. The initial arc is really trying to make a case to say that in order to understand the now, we need to understand the past. And it's an ethic that the Quran gives us itself. And by doing so, what we do is that we enter into a conversation with the past that sees certain types of actions as cyclical. I describe Iblis as being the world's oldest anthropologist, and the reason I do that is because this guy's been around for longer than human beings have been around. He's studied the human condition so well that he knows exactly what makes us frail, what makes us fallible. He knows how to needle every single part of us in order to try and kind of take us away from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in that sense, he's got a lot of information, and so we have been provided information too, which is how to resist him, how to stop that dhulm that he's trying to get us to do to ourselves and to others. And again, the Quran itself opens itself up to that. And so when we think about um, the modalities of oppression, the Quran gives us a lot of detail, actually, right from the very very beginning. We're taught about Iblis's initial sin. Of course, in Christianity, we're taught about this fallen angel, right? That's the narrative that you're given, who's the devil. In Islam, it's slightly different. Obviously, as human beings, we have a notion of this act of disobedience that Adam alayhi salam committed, right, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught him how to seek repentance for. But ultimately, the first sin that's presented to us really is that of Iblis's. This is a righteous person. And Iblis's entire argument is really for want of a better term, a genetic one, that I am better than him. That's the argument that Iblis is making about Adam alayhi salam. You made me out of smokeless fire. You made him out of clay. The properties that make up my body are superior to the properties that this other creation is made of. This is ultimately, it's a racist argument. You can't really get around it. Of course, it's rooted in arrogance, right? But it's based on the fact that he felt superficially there is something that is superior about him because of his makeup. And you come across any racist argument from that time until the present day, you'll see permutations of that argument taking place. And ultimately, what is Iblis's role? What is he trying to do? His entire modality of oppression is about division. You go through any of the hadith literature, you go through the Quran itself, you see how people oppress one another. It's about creating divisions between us, between societies. Many of you will be familiar with the hadith of the devils that come to say to Iblis each at the end of each day, what they've given accounting for what they've been involved in. And Iblis tells them one by one, that you're no good to me, you're no good to me, you've not done anything, until this one shaitan comes to him and says, I stayed with a husband and wife from morning until night, until I sowed a seed of discord between them. And Iblis takes him close and says, you are my kind of right hand person. And that tells us something about what he privileges in his own schema of oppression, which is that at both a macro and a micro level, divisions between us are his entire mode of operation. That's how he causes fasad, by keeping us away from one another, by disuniting us. And so, of course, we'll talk a little bit about this later, but the panacea to that, of course, would be to unite. That would be really the way that we need to think about that. And of course, there's other examples in the Quran as well about how disunity as a method of operation is so endemic to oppression as a structure. So in Surah Qasas, in the first few ayat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he tells us that Fir'aun, he split the society into parts, and then he oppressed Bani Israel, killing their children and enslaving their women, right? Why are these verses so important to us? They're important because there is a process that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing. In order for the killing of the children to take place, in order for the enslavement of the women to take place, there is a predicate step to that happening. And that predicate is the division of society. Fir'aun split the society into portions. So if you think of Egypt at that time being this kind of multicultural place where it's a civilization, right? You have people coming from all over the world, inhabiting that space. In order to make his oppression of Bani Israel easy, he had to split the society into parts first. And it's always the same process. It's not you. It's not you all. You're all fine. It's that group over there. They're the troublemakers. They're the ones I have a problem with. Just let me, kind of go after them. I'll leave the rest of you alone. And this is a classic tale that, has repeated itself many, 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 many times over the years. If you look at, for example, Ilan Pape's book, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, he describes in detail Operation Dalit, which was what? It was a program that the Zionists had for 20 years before the Nakba, before 1948, to do what? To map every single Palestinian village in terms of who were the military age males, where was each and every single gun, revolver, rifle in each town kept, in whose homes were they kept, where were the other kind of artillery resources that these villages had. They had a full mapping of every single town that they approached during the Nakba. And ultimately, what we have with that is that Palestinians themselves were involved in helping to map those villages, right? And so they took advantage by relying on Palestinians within some of these villages in order to do that mapping process, so that when it came to actually carrying out the Nakba, they were able to do it very, very efficiently. Again, in 1492, taking another example, we see the expulsion of Jews from Spain. it's interesting that it happens in 1492 because literally it takes another just over 100 years for the Muslims to be expelled in exactly the same way. And of course, I don't have a specific answer to this, but I do wonder a lot about the extent to which Muslims didn't play a role in stopping that mass expulsions of the Jews when it took place. At least the Muslims that were in Andalusia at the time, in the areas that hadn't been conquered up until that point. So again, something for us to think about in terms of how division takes place, how when we see other oppressed groups, how we play a role. So I'm going to try and move on a little bit because we have a lot to talk about, and I'm just worried we're not going to get through it all. I'm going to skip past the section on how we understand violence, and I'll move to the section where, yeah, I effectively speak about our role. What is what? Who are we within these major things that are taking place in the world, right? Some people might say, well, I'm just one person. I'm just an individual. I'm by myself, or, I don't really have any power in the sense of how we conceive of power in material terms, right? That you don't have the ability to affect change. And I think this is one of the really key um, kind of arguments that are presented in the Quran, that the notion of witnessing and being bystanders is such a huge part of the narrative that the Quran gives to us. And I actually take some of this argument from a conversation that I had with a dear friend, Dr. Uthman Latif, who's a wonderful scholar and a wonderful thinker of our times. He once kind of, we were speaking on the phone, and he said, Asim, do you know in Surah Al-Buruj that we have that there is this kind of notion of layered witnessing right within the first few ayats. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the witnessing of the heavens, his own witnessing, the witnessing of the soldiers that were killing these people, the witness in terms of the shahada, the martyrdom of the people who are being killed. For those of you who don't know the story that sits at the heart of Surah Al-Buruj, it's about a people who, without going through all of the details of it, who saw a contest between a king and a young boy. This young boy effectively said to the king, "You can't kill me." The king tried in many ways, and ultimately, the only way the king was able to kill him was by saying that, "I believe in the Lord of the boy." And the boy was a mu'min, he was a believer in Allah. So the king, after he says this and shoots his arrow, he kills the boy. Then all the people of the kingdom, who the boy had told the king, make sure that they come out to witness my killing, then they'll see that you're able to kill me. So they all witness this, and they all convert to Islam immediately. They all take their shahada. The king gets mad about this, and what he does is that he gets his soldiers to construct a pit of fire, into which he then throws these people, his own people who have now converted to Islam after seeing the boy had the miracle of the boy. So all of these people, from Allah to the heavens, to the king, to the soldiers, to the martyrdom, the witness through their own bodies, these are all witnesses to the event. So we have multiple layers of witnessing. And it was really striking for me, that whole argument. And Dr. Uthman, he mentioned a point to me. He said, Asim, do you know that there is a word that's used by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the surah that describes the way that the soldiers are sitting on top of this pit of fire? And he says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't use the word julus to describe their sitting. He uses the word qu'ud. And the word qu'ud means to sit back in a leisurely way. Like you're sitting down, you're relaxing, you're having a good time, you're enjoying some entertainment or the spectacle of something before you. This is what is used for the soldiers when describing how they are sitting in relation to this mass murder that's taking place. And I mean, I'll be the first to admit it. Sometimes some of these stories can seem almost fantastical. They can seem like out of reach of our notions of reality. And it just so happened that not long after that conversation, I was reading John Rees's new history of the Holocaust. And there comes a moment in the book where the Auschwitz Birkenau crematorium is being described. So the Auschwitz, it was the concentration camp, and next to it was Auschwitz Birkenau, which is where they were burning people, in many cases alive. And this person, he's a Jewish man. He's like sweeping the crematorium. So his job was to like sweep away the bones and the charred bodies after they had been burnt. Um, and he says that like one of the things that I found most difficult is as they're burning the bodies, you have the SS soldiers sitting while the burning is taking place, sitting in a leisurely way, listening to Mozart. As soon as I read that passage, I rang Dr. Uthman. I said, let me read you a passage and then tell me what you think. And he said, this is exactly like, what I described with in terms of the word Qa'ud in Surah Al-Buruj, right? And sometimes you read something that's closer to our notion of reality that really brings home, these examples that the Quran's got. Not that we deny, of course, what any part of the Quran. Of course, I would never even suggest that for a second. We believe in it completely and entirely. But it just brought that situation home in a way that I could never have fathomed before, really. To know and to see that somebody described it in those very terms. And so what we're taught is that we are witnesses, that we don't have that option to just simply stand by, to simply not be present in terms of our own culpability when it comes to what is going on in the earth. And I think another story in the Quran really gives us a sense of that, and that's the story of Ashab as-Sabt, the people of Saturday. So quickly again, for those of you who aren't familiar with the story in the Quran, there's a group of, it's another tribe from Bani Israel. They were given a test by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is that they were not permitted to fish on a Saturday, right? This is what we're told about these people. So they had to fish any day outside of that. And the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tested them was to make the water dry of fish throughout every single day of the week except for Saturday when it would be full. So now they've got a problem, right? Because the only day that they can get to the fish is the day that is not permitted for them to do so. So a third of them, they came up with an idea, or a group of them came up with an idea. They said, why don't we throw our nets out on a Friday and collect them on a Sunday? So this was their way of getting around this injunction that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them. So they're not fishing on the Saturday. So another group of them said, no, this is not permissible. You're trying to get around the commandment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's not right. You shouldn't be doing that. And the last group, they just remained silent about this. Now, in terms of the ones who cast the nets out, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punished them, right? Like that's very, very clear in the Quran. In terms of those who spoke out, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praises them and rewards them. And in terms of the last group that remained silent, now what Mufassirin say about this group is that just as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stayed silent about them, it indicates that they are also punished alongside those who actually carried out the deed, because they didn't actually actively take a role when they witnessed a wrongdoing. And we know this from other hadith literature as well, about the pious man in a town who was destroyed alongside his own people because he didn't give them da'wah, because he didn't correct them, even though he had knowledge. And actually he's told, the angel is told that start with him, because he didn't actually play an active role. And so this idea of being present in the societies that we live in, being present and witnessing the world around us, it carries an implication. And in my mind, that implication has so many more consequences, because for those of us who grow up in the West, we tend to think of this um, often in material terms. We don't connect where we are, who we are, which families we come from, the everything that we have, to rizq, to something that's been given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the thing about rizq is this, that if we understand that everything we have is the sole source of that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that we have obligations towards those things, then in the moments our presence in the moment that we are in comes with a burden. There is no such thing as um, a privilege that doesn't come with the burden that's attached to it, and that burden is our responsibility to the things that we've been given. And I always give this example. We have to ask ourselves, if we, those of us who were given these kind of British passports and raised in the West, if we will be judged according to the same yardstick as a fisherman off the coast of Somalia, who's, kind of biggest concern might be whether or not there's enough fish to feed his family and to feed other people, right? Or a farmer in Afghanistan who's worried about drone strikes from the Americans, or whether or not his vegetation will grow, whether or not the rain will come. Like, there are so many tests that Muslims around the world have. And for those of us who live in relative ease, who are being given and granted access and knowledge and resources and so many benefits in a material sense that others are not being given, like, how can we equate one to the other, right? How can we equate those who live in kind of less privileged parts of the Muslim world with the burdens that we bear? And I think that's extremely important for us to constantly think about. That, like, if you start totaling up all the risk that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you, and it's not a bad exercise to do sometimes, just kind of write out for yourself, okay, down to like the fact that you can feel in the tips of your finger, that your eyesight works well, or any of these things. This is all risk. The fact that you can see, the fact that you can hear, this is all part of something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us, and it's something that we have a responsibility towards, right? And so when we think about our place in the world, then we start thinking about, okay, well, that's everything then, right? It's about the food that we eat. Are we eating food that's halal and tayyib? Because that's the criteria for good food, right? Not just that it's halal, but it's also tayyib as well. Can we honestly say to ourselves, for example, that battery farm chicken is tayyib? I'm not giving any fatwas here, because obviously I'm not in a place to do so, but I think we have to ask ourselves serious questions about whether or not that food is right, ethically correct for us to eat. Now, something might be permissible, like from a halal and haram perspective, but there are, of course, we know that there are so many more shades in terms of our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You could do something that's completely permissible, but is it at the level of ihsan? Are we at that level where we are literally living our lives in a way that that is it's as if we see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in front of us at all times? And I'm reminded of the hadith which talks about the man in the desert. And this is the man in the desert, the traveler or the woman, like, they're a protected category of dua in Islam, right? Like, the traveler, she can make whatever dua that they want, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will accept him. But what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say about this person? That do they think that their dua will be accepted when their food is haram, when their drink is haram, and here's the third one, when their clothes are haram? So, like, how could clothes be haram? And I think that this is a question, especially in times of neoliberalism, that we have to ask ourselves. In Surah An-Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, do not consume wealth except, that which is by consent, right? And I remember speaking to, I was on a WhatsApp group with a group of scholars from around the Muslim world. And I was reading this ayah in Ramadan 2 years ago, and I messaged them. I said, "Hey, look, listen, guys. Like, if we're talking about consent, right? I know, for example, that if I went to shop at Primark tomorrow, I could buy a piece of clothing, offer plus acceptance for the law students, right? It's contract 101 equals agreement, right? That's a legitimate contract between me and Primark. But I know at the same time that there is a contract that exists between Primark and a corporation, a body, a governor in Bangladesh. And that person has all these other contracts with various other municipal figures and so on and so forth, that by the time that you get down to the sweatshop, the option that's presented to the guy in the sweatshop is you either take this wage or you die. That is the kind of options that they're given in life. And if you want to read a very, very good, excellent analysis of this whole notion of choice when it comes to sweatshops, read Michael New's Just Liberal Violence. Superb analysis on that debunks this idea that somehow the West is doing these people a favor. And so when you finally come to the conclusion, and not only New's book, but the work of many people who critique neoliberalism, is that we understand that the very, very kind of kind of happy materialist lives that we live in the West, it's built off of the back of the oppression of so many in the underprivileged world. And so even when it comes to the clothes on our backs, we have to ask ourselves questions around how we become complicit in harming others and what it means to purchase an item of clothing, knowing that there could be harm on the other side, knowing that that it could be coming from a Uyghur concentration camp. When we think about, say, for example, the people of Shu'aib in the Quran, right? What are they punished for ultimately? Yes, the sin that they're committing is that they are um, not giving a fair measure on the scales when they're trading with other people, right? That's a sin that they're committing. But what the scholars say is that what they're really punished for is their secularism. Because what the people of Shu'aib say to him is, what has the marketplace got to do with prayer? So they went against the idea of praying. That's not what they're punished for. They're like, they bought into Shu'aib. You're a good man, you're a righteous man, but don't bring that you're preaching in terms of God, in terms of prayer, into what we're doing in the marketplace. These two realms are separate from one another, right? And this is ultimately secularism, right? The idea that the things that we consume, the things that we trade in, that somehow they're separate in terms of their impact to our ibadah, to our worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I've got about 5 minutes left, so I just want to sorry, I'm just trying to think a little bit about what to take on next, because there's so much more of the book left to talk about. Let's talk about then what it means to live in these systems, right? And often people will tell you that just being in the system in itself is a panacea to the harm that we see. That representation politics is the ultimate ethic by which we live our lives, right? As long as you are present within the system, no matter what place you're at, like you've made it. You're helping to contribute to the forward movement of either Muslims or Black people or generally people of color, right? That in itself is an ethic. And I think it's important that we understand that in a system of structural violence and racism, it's very difficult for us to make that claim, especially when we have no evidence really that is actually the case. There's a really incredible book by James Foreman Jr. called Locking Up Our Own. And looking up our own focuses on the way in which the black bourgeoisie, right, kind of middle class black people in America were structurally needed in order to ensure that the system of mass incarceration could impact on less privileged black people. And the whole book charts it in such incredible way, and it's really very, very moving from the very start, because James Foreman Jr. is a defense lawyer himself, and he's describing this moment in a Washington court where he said, look, the court that I'm in is effectively the ultimate pinnacle of black representation. The judge is black, the prosecutor is black, the defense lawyer is black, the police officers are black, the bailiffs are black, the jury is black, and the defendant is black. So the whole courtroom is black, right? So representation politics teaches us that when we're in this moment now, things should be easier. He says every single time the judge will give a harsh sentence to a young black man than to anyone else. He goes, because of the way that we've internalized racist attitudes towards our own. And that's important for us to remember and think about, that we can become effectively complicit in our own oppression when we think about our own success in material terms as being the ultimate pinnacle of representation politics. And the Quran, I believe, gives us an example of this through the story of Qarun and the secret believer. And Surah Ghafir is such an amazing surah in order to think about representation politics. So what do you have in Surah Ghafir? You have Qarun, right? He is, according to the Mufassirin, many of them, they say he is the paternal cousin of Musa alayhi salam, right? So this man Qarun, he's from Bani Israel. He's from the people of Israel, right? So he is from the oppressed class of society. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say about this man? That Qarun oppressed his own people. He's from the oppressed class, but he's considered an oppressor himself. Why? Because he used his position to get close to Fir'aun in order to materially benefit himself. So he's seen as what? A betrayer. That's the narrative that the Quran gives to us about him. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the damnation of Fir'aun, it's Fir'aun and Haman and Qarun and the Mali'in and then the soldiers, right? So there's only three people who are actually mentioned by name, right? One is Fir'aun, one is Haman, who's like his, chief of staff, right? And then Qarun, this guy from Bani Israel, who's from the oppressed class of society, who works with Fir'aun, but he's mentioned by name within the Quran as somebody who's an oppressor, somebody who's damned along with Fir'aun. That's really significant because, when we have these moments where we find ourselves and we're being taught that the most important thing is for you to just gain access, right, to be relevant. We have to really question our own heart as to whether or not we are capable of surviving a system of structural racism and oppression. Are we simply, we have to question the state of our heart to ask it whether or not we can handle this. Because interestingly, of course, you've got Qarun, but you've got the secret believer as well, who's presented in the same surah. And what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say about the secret believer? That he is somebody that is praised. Who is the secret believer? Some of the Mufassirin say that he's the paternal cousin of Fir'aun. That's amazing. Like, you have this guy from the oppressed class who's the paternal cousin of Musa alayhi salam, and you've got another guy who comes from the royal family of Egypt, from Fir'aun, who is the paternal cousin of Fir'aun. At least some of the Mufassirin say, at least anyway. I think Ibn Abbas mentioned this point. And what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say about this one? And this person is in the structure of oppression. He's so close to Fir'aun that when Fir'aun says about Musa alayhi salam, let me kill this man, he says, would you kill somebody just for saying his Lord is Allah? The same words that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu will say many years, hundreds of years later. He's the one who first uses those words, right? What does he do? When the moment arrives, he's got a platform. When the moment arrives for him to use his voice in order to defend Musa alayhi salam and defend Bani Israel, he uses it to good effect. Okay, regardless of the consequences. Fir'aun's, kind of all powerful. He could kill this man, but he uses that position that he has close to Fir'aun in order to speak the truth. And that's the problem that we have with representation politics, that by the time you've risen up these ranks and you've gotten to that position, more often than not, you end up reinforcing the system of structural racism rather than using that moment in order to speak truth. And I think there's very, very important for us to think about this in terms of Islamic scholarship as well. We look at people like Sheikh Ali Gum'a, who used his position as a Islamic scholar in order to call those protesters at Rabah like Kilab al-Nar, like the dogs of hellfire, kind of okaying, not only okaying, actually encouraging the mass killing of protesters using religion, right? So when we think about representation, we also need to think about how we end up maybe collaborating in a system of structural oppression that we see. And there's a really interesting book by a 16th century scholar. His name is Sha'rani. And Sha'rani, he writes in this book about kind of gullible mendicants and kind of like sold out scholars. I can't remember the name exactly off the top of my head. But what he effectively says is that don't, as scholars, and I would extend this to anyone who is close to power, who has like their faith in their heart. Now, don't get close to an emir, don't get close to somebody in power if you have a love of dunya in your heart. Because if you have a love for the dunya in your heart, there is no way that you will be able to counteract that, what that emir, what that person in power is able to give to you. You won't have the ability to push back against it. So I'm gonna hopefully pick up the rest of this in the Q&A, inshallah, but I'm just gonna leave you with what I think are the three sites of virtuous disobedience. I think we need to be disobedient in the types of language that we use about ourselves and that we allow others to use about us. Words like terrorism and extremism, they're very, very harmful, and we shouldn't simply just allow it. I think we need to be disobedient to the knowledge that is produced about us. So when we see statistics and data and whatever, like you guys have seen probably the news about the Quilliams grooming gang report and how the Home Office rubbished it, right? That is exactly the kind of knowledge base that is being produced about us that we should be debunking and being disobedient towards. And finally, we should be disobedient in terms of how we build community. We shouldn't just simply accept notions like the nation state and our citizenship as being the ultimate priorities by how we self-organize and what we prioritize as being important. The whole, Salman Saeed in Recalling the Caliphate talks about the ummah being a horizon, right? And I very much appreciate what he says about that, because it in so many ways it's something that is always there for us to push towards. We still haven't got there yet, and it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about the modalities of Iblis, that he really his emphasis is on disuniting us, and so we have to do our best to try and stop that, bi'idhni ta'ala. So I'm going to end that there, inshallah, and hoping, because unfortunately I have very, very strict end time because I've got another thing after this. So inshallah, hopefully we can have some time for Q&A now. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from you guys now. Barakallah feekum.
Jazakallah khair for that. We'll start the Q&A now. Sorry, just a minute while the tech team shares the Slido questions. Okay, so while we are waiting for the tech team to put that up on the screen, there is a question in the chat box. I'll read that. if we can start with that, inshallah. So somebody asked, if surviving amongst those systems isn't the best option, what's the alternatives for Muslims in every field of expertise, even more in fields crowded by white people, hoarding power, opportunities, network means?
Exactly. That's a really great question by Sally, I think it is. Um, yeah, and that's a difficult one. I think one of the things that you know I guess I didn't focus on enough is this idea that we have been given like individual capacities based on the risk that we have, right? Like we Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already told us that He's not going to burden us with anything that we can't take, right? Like, so what we have, the resources that we have, the networks that we have, the abilities that we have been given everything that we can work with, um, and whatever we face within those resources that we have been given is something that we can handle, right? So that's the starting point for our, I guess, spiritual relationship to the world that surrounds us, you know. So whatever you do, you have to try your best at any space that you've been given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to try and bring about as much change as you can and to worship Him in the best way possible. The result of your actions is not for you. And again, I want to make that clear that there is no emphasis anywhere in the Quran that success looks like a material success. The only thing that is success as it's presented in the Quran is the state of your heart when you meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's it. In fact, if anything, in a material sense, we are told again and again and again in the Quran that success is can look like material failure. Ashab al-Ukhdud, the people that they kill, right? The people of the ditch, the ones that they kill, those people failed from a worldly perspective, right? Like from a material perspective, like in capitalist terms, right? This is like a complete loss, right? They failed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants them the greatest success. The magicians who battle Fir'aun, right? We're told about their story. They see Musa alayhi salam's miracle and they immediately prostrate themselves, saying, "We believe in the Lord of Musa," right? Fir'aun immediately says to them that I'm going to crucify you from your opposite hand and your opposite foot, right? I'm going to cut these off and I'm going to crucify you. And they say, do with us as you will, like we're not going to change our faith. And so Fir'aun kills them. They've been Muslim for like, you know, 20 seconds, like the same people who get burnt in the ditch. Like they've not been Muslim for very, very long at all. And yet again, they are described as being the successful ones. So success, when we live in this time of like immense materialism and capitalism, we're constantly taught that success is based on how we affect change, right? And I think this is something that a lot of different social justice movements suffer from, that I think we as Muslims should not try and replicate, that we don't judge our efforts alone by efficacy. That doesn't mean we should be dumb and we shouldn't plan and we shouldn't strategize and we shouldn't try and use all of the resources that we can as effectively as we can, but that we have ultimately a spiritual connection to this work that we do, so that whatever space we find ourselves in, the question we should be asking ourselves is, am I operating in the most ethical and righteous way that I can in terms of achieving some good in this dunya, right? That's the emphasis for us, because ultimately you're going to stand by yourself on Yawm al-Qiyamah, and some of the most terrifying ayats in the Quran as a parent are those that come in Surah Abasa, right at the end. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that on that day, you'll all be fleeing from her. يَوْمَ يَفِرُّ الْمَرْءُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ وَأُمِّهِ وَأَبِيهِ وَصَاحِبَتِهِ وَبَنِيهِ, right? Like that, these categories of people that you love so dearly will be fleeing from you. So we cooperate as much as we can in this life, but we know ultimately at the end of the day that what we're working towards is our individual akhirah, right? So at all times and in all places, the question we must constantly remind ourselves of: am I doing the most ethical thing? Don't worry about what other people are doing. Worry about how you are trying to change whatever you get, even if it's the smallest of thing. Like I remember one of my shuyukh once said to me, don't belittle placing your signature on something that is righteous. If it's a petition, don't belittle that act as an act of ibadah. You don't know if the sincerity of your heart in that moment is the thing that takes you to Jannah, right? Like, don't belittle any act. Don't secularize these acts that we do of activism and of change making from the akhirah, because what matters is the state of your heart when we do these things. Like literally signing, I remember, going around the UK trying to get signatures for Barbara Ahmed, many years ago. um, and and that was the one thing that kept on like sticking in my mind, that maybe these signatures that people put their names to, that will be what saves them on Yom Al Qiyamah. And so, yeah, we want to try and avoid as much as possible, um, accidentally falling into ideas around efficacy as being the most prevailing metric of our of how we operate. Because one thing that you cannot account for is barakah. I have seen karamat in my work over the last 20 years. I'm telling you, to the extent that I've had non-Muslim colleagues say to me that I have at the end of a case, that what we went through with this case was only possible by some kind of divine intervention. That these doors just opened up for us, that the person that you needed him at the exact moment that you needed him to open the right door for you just literally popped out of a car and stood next to you and randomly started conversing with you. I've been in that moment that cracked open an entire case. Like, like, you cannot make these things up. When you step on that path for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will see these miracles happen in front of you. Wallahi, I'm not joking with you. I've seen it myself. It's they are there. Allah's help comes always. And so, while I'm not giving you any like practical advice in that sense, ultimately I don't think practical advice is the important thing here. I think what's important is like reminding ourselves of the states of our heart when we're doing this work and connecting to that more than anything else.
Thank you, Dr. Austin. We'll start the Slido questions now.
Sure.
Okay, so the first question is, what can we do as individuals to make a difference to those suffering globally?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, this comes down to kind of capacities, right? I think there is a very minimum thing that we can do, which is to first educate ourselves about what's happening to those who are suffering globally. That's like for those of us who grew up in the West, and we have some of the ease of growing up in this. And of course, everybody has individual circumstances. There may be some of you out there who are finding life very, very difficult for a number of different reasons. So I'm speaking in a generality here about the vast majority of people who grow up in relative comfort. And I mean relative comfort to the whole world, as opposed to relative comfort in the UK. You know, the ideas that we ingrain ourselves about how we use our time, whether or not we're using our time effectively to learn about the plights of others, to educate ourselves better. Again, like I mentioned with the previous question, when we're thinking about what we can do, right, it's about not belittling any action. If you hesitate at retweeting something that you feel was important, but you feel like, well, what's the point, right? That's the wrong metric. The right question is like, what stopped you from doing something that could have been an act of ibadah for you, right? Literally pressing a retweet button or a share button or whatever it is, right? Just to like, for the sake of your own heart, to know that it's connected enough to take a small action. Small actions make a difference because they're the ones that, when they're done consistently, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves the most, right? And so, we have to start small, but then what we do as we grow outwards, we think about our skill sets, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given every single person some kind of skill set, right? We have to try and be aware of what our skill sets are, in order that we can then use them to the best of advantage for his sake alone. And one of the things that's sometimes worthwhile doing is literally get a piece of paper and write down every single decision that your grandparents made on both sides of the family, that your parents made, and that you made. And when you do that exercise, what you will see is how much of the things that we take for granted are our own decisions are actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hand guiding not only you but your family as well to be in the moment that you're in right now. And when you have a sense of the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala led you here into this moment, then you get a sense of the obligation that you have to what you've been given. And so what I recommend always, like for me, like I was good at English, alhamdulillah, I was good at studying law, and so I made a decision that in order for me to be best connected to him subhanahu wa ta'ala, it was to go down the path that I have. Now I have lawyer friends who, for example, just do defamation law. So they represent Muslim clients. When evil things are said about them, take on the newspapers and kind of public figures and whatever and sue them. I think that's really righteous work. They're using a specific skill set that they have to do something that's good. Now, this could be in engineering, it could be in medicine, it could be in anything, it could be in anthropology. But how the question you have to be asking yourself all the time is, what am I doing with this risk? What you've learned, this degree that you have, is not just by you, it's by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guiding you. How am I using this to the maximum that I can as part of my worship? So inshallah, I know it's again abstract, but I prefer to think of things in terms of ethics, and how we internalize those ethics rather than simply saying, okay, this is, you need to join this organization or you need to do that thing. I think that doesn't help us because everybody has a very, very individual circumstance.
The next question is, I have always been asked, what's the point of being aware of what's happening in the world in terms of news/history? People tend to consider it as a waste of time or pointless knowledge. I've always found it difficult to explain why it's important to be aware. How would you explain it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It kind of ultimately comes down to, what's the point of anything really. As Muslims, we we have been given something that is very, very, very unique in the history of the world. This idea of this ummah, right? Imagine that we have like this blessed being that was sent on the earth, Prophet ﷺ, who considered us, those who didn't get to see him, as his brothers, right? And part of the legacy of what he sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave us, of course, through the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is this idea of ummah, is this idea of being connected to one another. And so when you understand what the ummah is, that it is this whole body, that it is this whole body that has a sense of ethical duty to every single part of that body, whether it's the capillaries or it's the fingertip or the nail or the hair or whatever, or lack thereof sometimes, but whatever it might be, that you have a connection to it. And when one part of it hurts, that the rest of the body is supposed to hurt with it. One of the greatest tricks that colonization played on us is that it removed that sense of ummah from us. So the pain that we felt became increasingly abstract. I've spent a lot of time in the National Archives at Kew, and I found documents from the early 1900s where you've had the Dinshaway massacre take place by the British, these hangings that took place, a quelling of a riot in Egypt against British colonial rule. They hung a lot of innocent people, unfortunately. But what was interesting about this moment in Egypt is how within a short, very, very short space of time, you've got a British spy in Bahrain writing back to the authorities saying there is a meeting taking place right now where you have two sheikhs standing at the front and 200 Muslims packed in a room, and the two sheikhs are giving a presentation about our quelling of the rioting at Dinshaway and the hangings that took place. And I was like, subhanallah, before social media, before the internet, before any of this stuff, when something of harm was taking place in the Muslim world, there were events like the kind that Cage put on, or Friends of Al-Aqsa put on, or any number of Muslim organizations that are interested in rights and justice, standing there in front of a group of 10, 15, 20, 100, 200 people, saying this is what's happening in the ummah right now. We should be caring about this. We should be concerned about this. The British had a word for this. It was called pan-Islamism, right? That's how they would describe this caring and this connection between different parts of the ummah. And the great concern that we have right now is that that is the emphasis on so much of their programs and policies, is to reduce us to British Muslims, American Muslims, Pakistani Muslims, Nigerian Muslims, whatever it might be, right? We are limited to our nation states, that the ultimate priority that we have is to those immediately around us. And I think that's a mistake that we need to constantly be aware of and rectify, because we've forgotten what Ummah has meant, for us all.
Thank you. The third question is, what book would you read twice from the collection you have?
Jazakumullah khair. That is a really good question. God, I'd read so many of these twice. What book could you read twice from the collection that you have? I'm going to come back to that one. That question is too hard to answer right now, because there's just so many excellent books out there.
Okay, we'll come back to that, inshallah. The next question is, what was the book about fast fashion, how we aren't actually helping the people in the less developed countries through sweatshops?
Okay, so the book isn't about fast fashion. It's Michael New's book, Just Liberal Violence. So what he does is that he takes apart the arguments that are made by liberals, right? So he's not really concentrating on neocons here. He effectively centers three major areas in the work, in terms of arguments that liberals make. So liberals make arguments in relation to war, that war is a good thing, especially against kind of like civilizationally backward countries. They make an argument about torture, that torture is needed and it's necessary. And they make an argument about, and the third argument is they make is about sweatshops, that sweatshops are needed as part of the trickle down effect of economics in order to keep people alive. And that ultimately we're doing them a favor by giving contracts to these sweatshops in the first place. And what Michael New does is that he dismantles the main kind of thinkers who promote these ideas within liberal spaces, and shows exactly why they're wrong. And so it's not strictly about fast fashion, but he does cover some aspects of fast fashion within his book as well.
Thank you. The next question is, can you clarify about the Nakba and the Palestinians mapping themselves? Why would they do that?
Yeah, it's a good question, subhanAllah. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to not being fully aware of what was happening, but also the monetary incentive that was given. They were paid heavily to give up that information. There's a really very, very dark book. It's a satire, but it's very, very dark. It's called Saeed the Pesoptimist by Emil Habibi. It's a really, really wonderfully written book. It's very, very dark in its humor, but it's effectively about one of these Palestinians who would inform on other Palestinians in kind of around that period. It's a very, very interesting kind of book, and of course it's based on a great deal of real life experience. So yeah, Emil Habibi's Saeed the Pesoptimist is a very, very good read on this. But then you'll find this in lots of different circumstances as well. If you read Malik Sajjad's Munno, which is a graphic novel about Kashmir, like he goes through a lot of this as well. And so you have these collaborators sometimes they're not they don't mean to be collaborators. Sometimes they're just not they're just unaware, but sometimes also they're a bit heedless as well. And in many cases, the incentive that they're given is just too much. And I think that speaks a little bit to Qarun, right? For Qarun, like, of course, you know, he had family that were being oppressed still, but the incentive that he was given was too huge. He was given such a position of strength and authority, and also it gave, you know, it gave others within Bani Israel this idea that they um, they should desire the same thing for themselves too. That, and it kind of kept everybody in their place a little bit. So it's quite interesting how that psychology works. There's a great book by Frantz Fanon called Black Skin, White Masks. There's other versions of that book that were written later that cover similar areas. Hamid Dabishi's Brown Skin, White Masks. Is that right? Is that the title of the book? Might have got that wrong. But also Yasser Morsi's Radical Skin, Moderate Masks is another excellent book that kind of talks about the psychology of people who kind of play to this role as native informants or collaborators. Definitely worth picking up those books, inshallah.
The next question is, how can we be vocal about atrocities that are happening around the world without compromising our faith?
Excellent question. So, you know, I think the ethic of the Quran provides us is what, you know, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى, that and cooperate with one another based on righteousness and God consciousness. So there are two elements to this, that when we're talking about atrocities and oppression that are taking place, that it has to be based on a sense of justice, right? A sense of what is right, what is right ethically, religiously, you know, from a number of different angles. But it has to also be based on taqwa, our consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We cannot simply uh, take part in talking about something that wrong that's taking place, you know, if it means in some way that we are compromising our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because in that compromising we lose the element of ibadah that we were supposed to start with in the first place, right? So that, I think, is crucial. And of course the best way to do that is to constantly be engaged in the Quran. Like, brothers and sisters, really, if reading the Quran is not the first thing that we do every single day, then there is a problem in terms of our relationship with it. um you know, I'm literally saying that if you are not doing that, then tomorrow start one ayah with one ayah of tafsir with it. I really recommend reading a translation alongside reading the Quran itself, even if it's just an ayah, but make tadabbur of it. You know, reflect, contemplate on what you're reading, even if it's small. And honestly, there is no better protection against it. I remember having a conversation with Sheikh Jafar Idris once, and I asked him, like, because he, you know, his expertise is in Western philosophy. And I said to him, and as somebody who's like read a lot of Western philosophy, I said to him that, you know, I find some of their arguments very compelling at times. How is it that you, having read like literally the entire canon of Western philosophical thinking, haven't fallen kind of victim to some of the arguments that he made? He said that because for every page of theirs that I read a page of the Quran. It's how he kept himself rooted to his faith. And so, you know, when we're thinking about all of this activism that we're doing, it's so important that we also kind of remain rooted to the Quran as we're doing it. Otherwise, you lose anchor, and you can start kind of, you know, floating off in different directions. So inshallah, I think that's probably the best advice that I can give.
Thank you. The next question is, how can we discover our skill sets? And once we discover them, how can we utilize them in a way that's unique and original?
That's a really good question. And I'm not sure. As somebody with three sons who's constantly trying to like figure out what they're best at, it's such a hard one to do because sometimes people are, obviously, course, many people are multi-talented. It's not just about necessarily skill. It's also about interest as well. I think that sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can inspire you with a particular interest in something that, and in yourself, you recognize is unique. Some people just love languages. They just want to constantly learn more languages. Other people are readers. That's, I don't really have many skills, but I guess the one that if I did have one is that I'm able to read more than most people for very long periods of time. Is it a skill or is it something that I developed? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I've just been reading since I was very, very young. So it's part and parcel of who I am now. Um, but yes, once you identify what that skill or that interest is, then to be consistent with it, even if it's a small amount, right? And I come back to this again, that literally the most beloved deed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the deed that is done is that is done um, in a small amounts but consistently, right? So whatever it is, make sure that it's something that you're keeping it every single day, because then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put barakah in it for you as well. And that's so crucial. We forget the element of barakah in these things, that when we have that relationship with what we're doing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that barakah comes through.
And then the next question is, any practical tips for doing tadabbur of the Quran?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so what I do generally is that I take a passage of the Quran in Arabic and I will read the English immediately after it. So when I read the Quran, I don't like read it for long periods without having an English text right next to me. Alhamdulillah, like my Arabic's decent enough to understand the Quran in Arabic for the most part. But there are clearly elements that I lose because I don't know the complexities of it. I'm quite happy to admit to that. And so, in order to really engage with its meaning, I have that process that I go through. But what I'm doing is that every single English version of the Quran is brand new. So I don't read the same English version again. I've got like multiple versions of the English language version, which I've annotated differently at each occasion, because the more you read the Quran, the more it opens itself up to you. Right. And so make notes, use sticky tabs, take like, reflect on themes that are important to you in your life as well. There may be something that's so important to you in your life at that moment that when you read the Quran with that thing in your mind, that that something comes out to you. Of course, read tafsir as well. Read the what the mufassirin have said about the Quran. Even though Sayyid Qutb's fi Dalal al-Quran isn't strictly a tafsir as much as it is kind of mixture of tafsir and tadabbur, I highly recommend it. Reading his fi Dalal opened the Quran to me in ways that I never imagined could be opened. It's for me one of um, the best things that I read that really opened my heart to the Quran in ways that, again, I felt that were unimaginable before. So I highly recommend that series of books and reflections that he has.
Jazakallah khair. And we are back to the second question. What
All
book
right.
would you read twice from the collection you have?
Okay. I mean, like, I would say I'll give you two books. One is kind of like ostensibly an Islamic book, although I don't really secularize what I read in that way. But yeah, I would recommend Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah's On Knowledge, which is an Islamic Text Society book. Um, yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful book, and I'm going to have to go with the autobiography of Malcolm X. Just I've read it more times than I can possibly count, and every single time I read it, just again, it's one of those texts that really opens itself up to you in surprising ways each time you read it. So yeah, those were the two I'd go for.
Thank you. This will be the end of this event. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Asim, for taking time out of your busy schedule to come be here with us today and sharing beneficial advice and stories.
بارك الله فيكم. السلام عليكم.
ريض يا الطارش يلم عنا خط بكتابك الترحيب.